that will actually reduce the effectiveness of the scheme.
Madam Speaker.
I call Mark Patterson.
Madam Speaker, it is a great pleasure to rise on behalf of New Zealand First to support this legislation, the Earthquake Commission Amendment Bill, of course amending the 93 Bill, which goes back to the original 45 Bill. And I actually want to just start and pause to reflect on that. In 1945, after the Wairarapa earthquake and of course subsequent to the 31 Napier earthquake that killed so many, 230 odd New Zealanders, the Fraser government, that first Labor government, put this far-sighted piece of legislation in hand. And I think the House should reflect as legislators that that is visionary and far-sighted and legislation that we should aspire to looking to achieve those same standards. We quite so often get caught up in the 3-year election cycle, but these pieces of legislation, and by crikey, didn't it come in handy. Of course, so recently we have had the devastating events of that cluster of earthquakes in Christchurch, and of course more recently the Kaikoura Seddon cluster of earthquakes. I'm not going to, I know there's been a little bit of politics played tonight, I'm not going to enter into that. I was not in Christchurch for those events. I can only imagine what it must have been like, and the magnitude of that disaster and 3 fairly large quakes there makes this something I think we need to reflect on what happened, but I think the people involved, and I note and I acknowledge the Honourable Jerry Brownlee for his contribution. When you are there in the heat of the battle, and we can put a forensic lens over this with the benefit of hindsight, but when you were there in the heat of the battle and you will have done your best for your city and for your country in those circumstances, and I certainly commend you for that, and subsequent ministers that have come in behind you. Of course, we heard there was 470,000 claims. Even the Kaikoura earthquake which probably wasn't as big in terms of the damage, was still 38,000 claims. So it shows you how this organisation, how important it is in responding to these sequences of quakes that we've been having recently. Okay, so this legislation comes from the review set up in 2012. I'm not sure if I would be critical. I think 2012, and we're here in 2018, and we've only got some interim measures to act upon. I'm not sure what's going on there. I'm loath to sort of wade in, but it does seem a little inappropriate that we don't have the full set of recommendations to act upon. But we do have the low-hanging fruit, and I commend Minister Woods in bringing those forward for us to look at today. New Zealand First is supportive of them. We've been supportive right through of all this, the legislation that's come through. In fact, one of my personal highlights, in fact the personal highlight of my time in this House so far, was the passing of the Christchurch Cathedral Bill. As a former Cantabrian, there was a lot of pleasure's not the right word, but acknowledgement for the people of Christchurch. I knew how much that meant to them. But so we'll go to the 4 proposed changes in the bill. The exiting of the personal property or the contents insurance, I think that's been well covered. Contents, that provision is overly complicated in response. You're dealing with as vases or televisions and the like, and that's not life-changing stuff. That's stuff that can be replaced relatively easy. And I note that deflation in those sort of items too, a flat-screen television, for example, that may have cost $5,000 or $6,000 10 years ago, it can be bought for mere hundreds. So it's not probably the death blow that losing one's property is and the circumstances. So I think that's a very good common sense part of this legislation that I'm sure will not have much opposition through the select committee process. I note in the Kaikoura earthquake sequence, 80% of those claims did not include content, so it hasn't been too much of a major feature anyway latterly. Increasing the cap to 150,000, I think that's again eminently sensible. I think when the houses were, when this legislation originally came in '93, that would have been a much larger chunk of the replacement. But I do concur with the views that have been put forward before. I think there is some personal responsibility here to make sure you're insuring your house and your contents and your vehicles and other things. You shouldn't be looking to the state unnecessarily. But I think that having this provision there, it does give our insurers and reinsurers the confidence that we have the capacity to respond and for them to be able to go into the private market. So I think by having these provisions, we're helping keep premiums down on a yearly basis. The lengthening of the claim deadlines, I think this is probably the one has been identified earlier on that the Select Committee will probably have a little bit of a play around with. I think, if you go back to Christchurch, there was the September 10 through to sort of June 11, that sequence. How does that all, what was the real life experience that we went through there and how does that reflect what we're looking to put up in legislation? So unfortunately we've got a lot of experience to draw upon, but I'm sure that will be ironed out within that Select Committee process. The data sharing, I think that's also one that has come forward out of experience. We need to be able to provide the information in a timely manner to the people that need it. New Zealand First is always a little bit loath to extend powers of the state or privacy, weaken privacy provisions, but we do note the oversight of the Privacy Commissioner. We've seen a lot of input from the private insurers and other expert parties within that process, so we're confident that certainly within that Select Committee process that those privacy provisions will be appropriately set and tested. I think that's probably all I've got to say on the bill really. New Zealand First does support this legislation. It is common sense legislation to bring forward those measures that we can reasonably do in lieu of the full report. So it makes sense to do this. The sequence of events we've had over the last decade suggests that we haven't got time to wait. So we support bringing those forward. This should make EQC fit for purpose, and I must say it also allows us to learn the lessons that have been so hard won. So New Zealand First supports this bill and has pleasure in recommending it to the House. Thank you.
Madam Speaker.
I call the Honourable Nikki Wagner.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I too am